Hello and welcome to the Black Soldier Fly Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, David Taverner, and in this series we dig beneath the surface to uncover what's really happening inside the Black Soldier Fly industry. Hello, welcome to this week's episode of the Black Soldier Fly Leaders Podcast. With me today, I have someone called Heidi Hall, who is a fellow Nuffield scholar like me, travelled the world looking at various different agricultural topics. We'll dig into it in the episode, but also someone who works for the feed additive company, Ampario, so understands all about agriculture and livestock and feed, and maybe how black soldier flies could fit into the industry. But let's find out. Heidi, thank you so much for appearing on this podcast. Would you like to quickly answer, or not so quickly, take your own time, how you got into the wacky world of black soldier flies in the first place?
Hi, David, and listeners. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, so I worked for a company called AB Agri when I started there as a graduate about 12 years ago. In that, I started a project, or we had a project looking at, it was housefly at the time, it was Musca domestica, and in terms of the risks of feeding it back to poultry. So it was a closed loop. So we were rearing with we were working with Ferra at the time and other partners. It was an Innovate UK project, and we were feeding housefly or rearing them on poultry manure. And then we were looking at the risks inherent in that, forced cannibalism or various other aspects, heavy metals and such things when we fed them back to poultry. And
What did you find?
what did we find? I suppose at the time we were on the wrong insect for one. We were looking at housefly because it was easier in terms of maybe being less need of higher temperatures and more akin to sort of temperate zone in the UK. There was a bit of a preference at the time, which sort of dwindled out. They could grow on various ways, which also obviously black soldier fly can. What did we find when you had gut clearance and a proper quality control? There was you could mitigate all the perceived risks. So we were also looking at antibiotic use or other controlled additives used in the poultry side, and you couldn't find them either. We published that. It was a good project. As with every project, dissemination could always be improved. But during that, we then sort of as a company got a little bit more interested in novel proteins, and that was then my next role within AB Agri. We had an alternative protein division, so I kept in the loop really from that perspective, and I was involved in another project which was European called Invaluable, which was mealworm, with Danish Technology Institute, and that was also really good, very different. That was on food waste, and they also were looking at black soldier fly, but it wasn't part of that project.
When was this project, when you were doing this?
That would have been, I left AB Agri around 8 years ago, so that would have been about 9 years ago, or just around that time that I was leaving, 8 years ago. And black soldier fly was really only done with AgriProtein, which was South African, which is gone now, and EnviroFly, which was a US-based company. Both were using animal protein waste, so either blood and bran was the South Africa model, sort of, and manures, even human manure in some cases, I think. And the US was lobster shells for all things, and other food waste, high quality sort of restaurant food waste and things like that.
Oh, right, okay.
So they're all, very different. Cricket meal was another one, but it was more for human food. Even back then, all slightly different restrictions and challenges. But at that time, nothing had changed in legislation. Legislation then changed, and it became farm livestock rather than terrestrial invertebrates. If they're terrestrial invertebrates, more easily be able to be fed to animals.
Well, this is quite a rich history in the industry, Heidi. So I'm glad to have you on the podcast. What have you been up to since then? How's your career path changed, and how's black soldier fly stayed within it?
Yeah, so I moved away from AB Agri for other reasons. I went into a role in more animal health side with a UK-based supplement or feed additive company, Ampario. They are all livestock, so pig, poultry, ruminant, aqua, equine even, for a small part. And my role is more in line with the sort of R&D side of our research. I still had a couple of papers that I was finishing off that we were publishing on the various projects, and kept in contact with a couple of the project leads. I wrote a chap. Well, we got asked to write a book, which was Cabby, so publishing house, which we may or may not have heard of. Do a lot of work in. They're global, but they raise funds for improving knowledge transfer into other countries for agriculture purposes. So that was good, and that was looking at insects as animal feed. And that book, when was that published? That was probably 2020, 2021, and we got various people. So I ended up bringing on two others to co-edit that with me. Lane Fitches and Rhonda Smith. We edited that, brought in a load of people to do the chapters, and so that was all previous people that I'd met, and we were really more focused in that book on black soldier fly.
And what did you find out? Or what was the general premise?
The premise at the time was that legislation was holding it all back, which sadly, David, hasn't really changed. We're still beating this drum like 12 years on. In a nutshell, insects as animal feed is sort of, if you were a child and you saw animals in the wild, and pig and poultry primarily, but obviously fish, major part of their diet. And then, hang on, but that's not what we feed them. It really is like the writings on the wall in terms of logic for insects, in my mind. Any free range animal will eat insects. Any wild animal would eat insects in terms of, the omnivores. And
well, if you're talking about any child doing it, then you're talking about my son. He'd be eating insects as well.
Well, he would, but if you were sort of showing them what wild animals eat, and then saying to them, no, we don't let them eat what they would do in the wild. It's like this. We've created this system of mass producing animals for food, and we've taken out one of the cheapest, most numerous feedstocks. There is less logic there, but obviously there is so many potential risks that we need to manage all that. And I'm not saying we don't. I'm just saying we need to think about it in a big picture sense, that if we want to produce more protein for human food, we need to obviously make that easier, more accessible, all the things that circular economy looks at. And really that was the premise of the book, really. The main chapters were on a circular economy piece.
Yeah, okay. I think it's a really prescient point, and something that I was going to talk about a bit later on, regulation. But let's do it now because it's really important. For listeners' point of view, then Heidi and I are working together on regulations here in the UK. We're trying hard to change them, and we do know them fairly well, I think. So let's talk about this then. If the regulations haven't changed for a while, why do you think that is? That we're still banging that same old drum that regulations haven't changed?
I think, sadly, if you look at major changes in legislation, they really occur for two reasons. One, necessity. So the EU bans something, therefore something else must be available to do the same job or similar job. Easy one. Or, total lack of food would enable some of this stuff to happen quicker. Or money. And there is no Nestle or even Carg, massive business that is throwing billions of pounds at this to force it through quicker. The businesses that have started up, and there has been millions of pounds, don't get me wrong, if not some billions, but unfortunately that's all been sort of innovation fund or group funding, and it's not a massive business. And these massive businesses sit on the boards that enable legislation change in EU feed and feed additives, and really there's no major push. I think we're going to have to go the necessity route, and for me that means sort of it's going to take longer. We're going to have to start with smaller changes.
Yeah, from my reading of the anaerobic digestion industry, because that's done phenomenally well, considering that it doesn't make a huge amount of money, and it is propped up by European UK subsidies, or it has been. See where it takes it. But I've read into the past of how it started up or why it started up. And, there was this energy crisis, and,
Mm,
this was a renewable source of energy that has been that is circular, fed
yeah.
on waste organics. So what are the reasons for insects? What are the credible reasons for politicians
Mm.
or policymakers to change the regulation to enable insect production or circular economy insect production to happen?
Yeah, and that's it, isn't it? It's finding that need. I think on a nutrient and a circular economy basis, it's an easier question because we could be using insect and frass, insect wastes as fertilizers, and we could be using insects to upgrade waste materials, but we'd still be potentially leaving them in the frass and putting them back on the land, not eating, therefore, or not looking to change that feed for the other livestock, and it really it's a problem that was created by putting them under the farm livestock legislation. So
Mm.
an insect now in that legislation it should be fed everything that a normal sort of a pig or a chicken or a cow would be required, and that really does cut the list down on their substrates, as we would call them. It's not logical to rear insects, or it's not financially sensible to rear insects in that manner because it's just too much cost. And I think that then we need to continue with the innovation sort of funded work that proves that the risks can be mitigated. There's
Mm.
risks with everything. If you look at heavy metals, anything from the sea or limestone or mined materials are usually quite high in heavy metals, different ones, but still quite high. You can find problems in all or many feed materials. There's not much that doesn't have a risk, but it's knowing the risks, and that's then that risk-based approach to mitigate them. And that's not where legislation sits. That's where feed assurance sits. And when we use legislation to reduce or manage those risks, it becomes too arduous, too difficult to do anything different, and people, even pots of money get pulled away because legislation takes too long to change.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to the motives for why government would change the legislation regarding black soldier fly circularity. Everyone
Mm.
talks about black soldier flies being a sustainable protein, but you're potentially, from your feed background, is saying right now it's not, because there's too much risk with the food being recycled back in, and it's more of a frass nutrition, so
I
soil
think
nutrition.
it's an easier question to answer with the current political positions, I'd say. Certainly on an EU-UK basis, we don't seem to be going for self-sufficiency anymore. A number of years ago, the major supermarkets, by 2025, we are going to be free from imported soy. That was a major driver to
Sure.
insect production in the UK, because otherwise, how do you get
Really?
enough protein for pig and poultry? We're in 2026, and that has literally just fallen off the the target list. No one's even talking about it anymore, never mind sort of going, back on it. The only other major one that's sort of a target that you could try for is sort of, carbon neutral by 2030. That's still almost spoken about, but I don't even think that will be there by the time we get to 2030.
No,
You know,
yeah, it's 2050 seems like the goalpost for all countries at the moment. Is net zero 2050. That's kind of where
but even then, how do you get there from a net zero perspective? You could, because it's certainly got less air miles than soya. Animals got a requirement for soya. We've just sort of just jumped on it because it was a co-product. It's not necessarily totally a co-product anymore, because I think the animal requirements so high. But we need to try and have a longer outlook on our legislation and political drivers, and that's, I think, part of the problem. If you look at the policies and people in power today, are they going to be in power in a year's time, 6 months time, 2 years time? There's no stability there. So these things just, how important is black soldier fly in terms of policies?
oh,
It's
not
just
not
not.
at all.
It's not, is it, David? So
No.
we sort of like we're at the fray, really, aren't we? And geopolitical is a major, interest on all fronts. As problems of even wheat. If you look at Ukraine, that's really where all the wheat is, or a major part of EU, if not global wheat supply. Self-sufficiency should be on the agenda, even if it was, and that should be from a feed and an energy perspective. If the Iran stuff has got anything to go by. But it's just seemingly not. And I think that means we've got to look at reasons for black soldier fly being cost effective and nutrient cycling, being part of that costs. And we've got to then think about this being a real benefit to the farmer and the animal from a welfare perspective. And it's all
Mm.
smaller wins, I think. It's not going to get a big picture. Well, we need this because we don't have soya, or we need this because of net zero, or I don't think we're going to get them, the big ticket wins. And that means there's going to be less funding thrown around for it.
Mm.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because those companies that were rolling on funding and innovation bids and EU funded bids, that they've pretty much all run out of steam anyway, because the businesses wheels weren't necessarily turning as much as they could have done at the time. So yeah, it's a sad truth of where we are, I think. But the black soldier fly businesses have got to make money from the product, and it's
Yes.
all got to be really efficient. And so I don't think you can
Mm.
do that with using feed materials.
No, yeah, it's got to be kind of bargain basement materials, because that's the whole point of it, isn't it? Right, using
Yeah.
waste products, even getting paid to take these materials on.
Yeah, and that's where, when I worked for AB Agri, KW Trident is one of their businesses, or it's still part of the mix. And they were originally taking those waste, or co-product materials, and putting them in the beef industry. That's originally where those products went. AD then stole them, and they created an O'Neill was the not sorry not O'Neill. Amir was the name of the business, and it was all looking at AD feedstocks. And really, we're still in a little bit of, black soldier fly or insect production could be in competition with AD. I would argue, and I think it's logical to try and put them in parallel with AD. I think they need to help each other out. And there's certainly frass could go into AD, and it would dry up, or could AD pass, the liquid pass 100, 110, I can't remember which one it is now, but that could then, potentially be a feedstock for insects. The heavy metal risks around that sort of discussion could be more of a problem, because AD can also concentrate up some things, and you need to be really, looking at that in your feedstocks. But we need to work alongside AD, because I don't think AD is necessarily going by the wayside, even though the subsidies have gone. I think it's still, if you've got a gas to grid connection, it's still seemingly highly economical. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think there is value alongside AD. I think there's also value alongside, other farming practices where we have waste heat. If we're growing things and we need to produce heat, or we are producing heat as a byproduct, then insects obviously fit very nicely there.
Absolutely. I mean, we talk a lot about data centers these days as well, and the excess heat that they
Mm.
make, or
Yeah.
anaerobic digestion, or even some sort of excess heat from lots of different activities can be the source of power for insects. Because one of the major reasons why European factories are not doing so well is because of the price of energy and the
Hmm.
usage of energy in more temperate regions of the world. Whereas
Yeah.
you hear of this, it can't be done in temperate climates. Because of that reason, it's got to be in around the equatorial regions of the world.
Yeah.
Um, there's many other reasons why these companies collapse. That certainly is one of them. So, there is excess heat there, so it can happen. And I guess with the AD supply chains as well, of feedstocks coming in, you can
Mm.
kind of there's a bit of a fork in the road there. Certain feedstocks go into the AD, certain feedstocks go into the insects, and then they can kind of power each other. And like you said, you can mix in frass and digestate going one way or another.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, AD does much better when it's got a very stable feedstock. Is insects part of the way in which, and therefore the frass, part of the way in which you create a more stable feedstock, because it's almost like a pre-treatment.
Yeah.
I don't think we've fully looked at the synergies there in how they'd work best together.
No, I don't think people have, and it still confuses me, to be honest. It's one of those where I think someone needs to just go and do it, and report the findings, and see how it works.
Mm.
Everyone talks about insects eating everything, but they are still quite picky, and like anaerobic digestion, they need some sort of pre-treatment. The feed needs to be homogenized so that you've got
Mhm.
consistent outputs as well,
Yes.
just like AD. Otherwise, you don't get consistent outputs, and then your operation kind of starts to fall down as a result. And all of these challenges you've spoken about is just the symptoms of a circular economy where you're using lots of variety,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's heavy metal accumulation or it's the feedstock variability.
Yeah. When I was doing my travel for my field, which is one of the, well, I suppose the way we met David, my field was on pig gut health and whether you could reduce the need for antimicrobials and antibiotics through improving gut health and how you would do that. But I was in Canada and I was at the University of Saskatchewan, and I met a lady that had been doing some work on insects actually to reduce mycotoxins in grain. So they were using insects, and I think it was black soldier fly, but I could be wrong. I can send you the paper. They were using insects to reduce the mycotoxin load so that they could still then feed. So the frass was fed then, because how else would you use it?
The frass and the insects.
No, I think they would have taken the insects away because the insects would have had the mycotoxins in them,
Oh,
and
right.
the material left over, which should have been there for the frass, would have had a lower level of mycotoxins. And I
Okay, and
wonder,
so then you feed the frass to the pigs.
yeah, because you couldn't feed the, I think it was wheat, and it could have been Don or Zea, one of the sort of key wheat mycotoxins. So you couldn't feed that because it was over the levels on these mycotoxins, which we have
So you
levels of,
reduce the mycotoxin level down through
yes.
black soldier fly production, and essentially what it does, it just funnels it into the insects themselves. The
Well,
frass is left with a lot less. Is that the theory?
the question was, what is the insect doing? Is it somehow, you can't metabolize toxins? In ruminants, we sort of go through a little bit of a breakdown in the rumen where they detoxify it, but it's not really gone. What tends to happen is plants and animals add on carbohydrates or proteins, and they become sort of what we call a masked mycotoxin. And these toxins are less toxic, but they're still there. So that was my number one question. Is it that they are still there, but they're less toxic, but they're not then seen by the analysis techniques that we've got currently? So that would be number one question. But in the EU, you wouldn't be allowed to do that really, because you can't, A, if they're
No.
farm livestock, so you couldn't also feed them the high mycotoxin wheat. But B, you can't be seen as, well, I suppose you're not diluting. There'd be a little bit of a grey area as to whether you are technically diluting the wheat with the frass, and that is how the mycotoxins are being reduced. But it's an interesting concept, isn't it, that we're feeding insects something that is subpar, but they're able to live on it. And if we weren't classing them as farm livestock, would we have a better or less waste? This argument of around 30% of food and feed is wasted either before the table or after the table, depending on where you are in the world. Yeah. And the pre-table argument could certainly be reduced potentially with insects. I mean, in the Western Hemisphere, if we're wasting it after the table, then I think insects, I think we'd agree there. Insects could be used as a food waste reduction as well. But
Mhm.
I just think insects have got more value to give, and we've not really even scratched the surface because unfortunately legislation is holding even that back. Because even if you were to do that work, you'd have to have you'd have to get the Home Office like to give you derogation because they're farm
Mm.
livestock. We
It would
couldn't
have
even
to
do
be
research.
done in a lab, wouldn't it?
Even then, depending on where you are, you might have to get a derogation because they're a farm livestock.
And
You have to put in the report.
that's an
Ethic,
ethical,
yeah,
yes.
the ethics of
And
it
so
would.
that's famously hard to get approval from, is it?
Well,
In a cottage industry like black soldier fly, for example, where you
because
haven't
who's
got
your insect vet?
yes, yeah,
Who's the insect vet that's going to be signing it off?
yeah.
We're not really there yet. We're sort of calling them livestock, but are they having a vet check?
But
It's just not. It's not the right way to manage those risks in my mind. We
so
did it because of we sort of like had a little bit of a too quick a reaction, and then it getting it rewritten or changing legislation now is so much harder because we had a knee jerk reaction to what probably was TSE and mad cow disease fear.
Yes, and I understand that, but it's kind of crippled a lot of the possibility, like you've very well explained. I want to move on to you. You're obviously in the livestock industry, and you have touched upon the nutrition, and especially with some of your scientific work as well. So, what's your view on the nutrition of insects, whether it's protein, fat, specifically as a...
Yeah, so we've done some bits and pieces. So like any animal, them themselves could be, or fat can certainly be changed, and fatty acid profile can. Would be harder to change protein because that's what they're made up of. It's like saying you could change your chicken protein by feeding it different things. Not really going to happen. But you could certainly have a fatter chicken or a thinner chicken, depending on how well they've been fed. So there's
Mhm.
things in black soldier fly and insect nutrition, any animal nutrition like omega-3 eggs that we can affect. But they are, really good. Black soldier fly, one of the good things about sort of the differences between the housefly and the black soldier fly was in that fatty acid profile. So they're similar to coconut oil in their fatty acid profile, very high lauric acid, which is antibacterial, antimicrobial, in some cases as an additive. Coconut oil was added to pig diets, certainly piglet diets, not anymore because of the costs involved, but from an added value perspective on a health benefit, they have that.
So hang on, you just touched upon not anymore because of the costs involved. So what's the
From
cost of
coconut
lauric
oil.
acid? The coconut oil for lauric acid.
So coconut oil, I haven't looked at this very recently, but it probably is around 1,500 pounds or euros, whatever you want to go with, per ton. Most oils are over £1,000. Probably could be higher now, but it sort of comes with other potentials in terms of or cost of getting it over because it's not a UK grown thing, is it?
Mm.
In terms of a local production, that'd be nice. But sorry, what was that, David?
Sorry, I just said famously they're not British. They're very
Yes,
tropical.
no, yeah.
Nice. Sorry, carry on. Rudely
Not at the end of the garden. But lauric acid itself, can be used as a feed additive. It's not an easy one. In terms of sort of long chain fats, they tend to be somewhat solid at room temperature and therefore are hard to add to feed. And so, I mean, one of the arguments for still being involved now that I'm at a feed additives company was one of the things we do well at Ampario is we put oils or fats, different types of fats, really. Quite a lot of it's omega-3 based algae oil now. We used to be fish oil onto a carrier because then it becomes more stable, easier to add to a feed formulation. So that would
what would
be
the
my
carrier be? Just
the
for
carrier.
I'm the idiot in the room.
Mineral based. So a mixture really of limestone and other mineral based carriers. So diatomaceous earth is usually in there, but it's not 100%. It be probably a 2 or 3 different mineral based carriers. We don't use vegetable based carriers. But the argument there would be, well, I'm still interested in black soldier fly because if we had a suitable source of black soldier fly oil, not even the protein, we could potentially put that on a carrier and have a look at the gut health benefits of adding it to piglet diets. It hasn't yet come off. If someone's looking at producing black soldier fly, they're usually targeting the protein, which is a higher ingredient inclusion in a pig or poultry diet. You're probably looking at 3 to 5%, for instance.
And it's a bigger proportion of the actual insect as well, I suppose.
It is, yeah, definitely. Probably around 40 to 60%, depending on what we're looking at. But the oil contingent, not many people are interested in because they think that is also a bit of a co-product. Whereas from my perspective, it could be more suitable to an additive feed.
Can you feed black soldier fly oil to pigs, poultry in the UK under legislation, and whether and perhaps as you described it, pre-table or post-table waste or feedstock
Do
being used in the insects?
Okay, so question number 1, because I think there's 2 in there, is can you feed oil to pig and poultry currently in the UK? The answer is yes, because it's not processed animal protein. It is oil, and there's no restrictions on that at the minute. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's a yes, and that's always sort of been a bit of a push from my perspective. The second question is, could you feed those insects that you were then raising for oil a non-feed or a waste material? I think it would sadly depend, because if it's got meat in the waste, or, if it's not table scraps, because there's a big thing obviously there, you can have supermarket non-saleable food that is vegetable or carbohydrate based that you could definitely feed them.
But that's
If it's
essentially pre-consumer, isn't it?
That is
Because
pre-consumer
it's been
waste, yeah.
separated at the supermarket before any
Yes.
consumer has touched it.
Post-consumer waste and meat therefore included, because you could have meat from a supermarket, but it's still
Or
got a
any
little
kind
bit
of
more.
animal byproduct waste as well, like manures and things.
Yeah, uncooked foods that, uncooked meats sort of have more red flags, don't they? So no, I don't think you would be able to do that. And I don't know, even if it's not necessarily by the letter of the law a legislation issue, because I think there's a little bit of a grey area there. It's making sure you could making sure you could assure that product. Any feed mill in the UK and Europe are, well, pretty much 90%, 99% of them are feed assured. So they have, either in the UK, there'd be UFAS. So they're using feed materials that are either UFAS, or they're using additives that are FEMAS. It's part of the AIC. Or there's other ones, PharmaQS, what's the other one? GMP Plus. These are all sort of equivalent, and they cover global, but they're a feed assurance that says it is safe from risks, or risks have been mitigated. You've tested for various things. The product is safe to be used in the feed chain, and therefore then in the food chain. And it's that bit that would also be a problem, I think, if you fed table scraps, post-consumer waste. And
Okay.
but that bit, David, I think is, we sort of still get hung up on legislation, but insect assurance standards are not there.
No,
If
there
insects
aren't.
are farm livestock, and this is probably a call out for Red Tractor and others, where is the farm livestock assurance? If
There
they
isn't.
are essentially a chicken without wings and feet, then they need a Red Tractor assurance, or they need a, whatever country you're in, your assurance standards, and we just don't have it. And there is no one, I don't think, working on it, sadly.
No, I don't think there is. So, has any of these commercial relationships happened where there is perhaps larger insect supply? Because the UK doesn't really have a massive insect supply. And if we're kind of creating meal and oil in different countries around the
Mhm.
world, well, correct me if I'm wrong, you've got a global role at Ampario, right?
Yes. So when I was still at AB Agri, we were looking at Asia, and South Africa. Agriprotein was still around, but they're obviously no longer. US and a bit of Canada. There is quality standards going on, and people are potentially doing it independently, depending on their company size. But from a use of the product into a feed mill, I think if you were growing it in the UK or EU, you would have a harder time. And I think it's just that it's new, and we need to continue with the conversations with these auditors and assurance bodies.
Okay.
I was in, before I wrote the book, there was an Insect Industries UK group, came out of the Food and Drink Council years ago now, probably 7 years ago.
Elaine
Um,
Pitcher.
and FERA were instigated, or really pulled that group together. And the BSI, the British Standards Industry Agency, and we had Red Tractor in there, and we had some others, and it was part of that remit to look at assurance standards and keep that conversation rolling. But I think that sort of dropped off a little bit, because there is now less of or maybe I'm just not involved in it anymore, David, and maybe you know more, but where's that conversation going with assurance standard people?
As far as I know, Heidi, there isn't much here in the UK, and that working group does sound like, it was probably the most likely to happen when that was around. INBIA, Insect Bioconversion Association, was the industry group, and that's kind of fallen by the wayside a bit now recently as well.
Okay.
So there isn't anything at the moment, Heidi, unfortunately. And if you're saying this is the biggest barrier from your point of view, that there's no quality assurance and standards for the insect production,
Hmm.
and meaning that you're not going to purchase it as a body, then that's kind of alarm bells to me to get this sorted. I mean, there's we talk about cost as well, but it doesn't matter so much if you haven't got any quality assurance, right?
Well, yeah, I suppose if we're talking about, without any personal want to see the product in animal feeds, for instance, if I was just Ampario, totally unbiased in this, looking at insect products, first question is, if I'm going to use it, cost has to be looked at. We need to make sure it's not going to break the bank. But can I use it? Tick boxes. Are you assured by any of those standards? So is the product FEMAS or UFAS, depending on what it is? If it's feed material, it's UFAS. If it's inactive, it's FEMAS. Or is it GMP plus? Or is it PharmaQS? Or is it, a another that's equivalent? And then if it is, I can use it. And then because we're not
It's
in the
almost like
EU,
your own regulation, isn't it? Like we've got all of these government regulations, but then even
yes.
if we change the regulations, but we don't have these quality standards, it's like a kind of an industry regulation.
It is. It is. It's the food. It's the feed chain. The food chain sort of quality and hygiene safety net, isn't it?
Mm.
We manage all that to ensure from our perspective, our milk can't use products that aren't assured. But then our products are only assured because they have ingredients that are from assured suppliers. So it's that whole link, and everyone will work on that same basis. And then supermarkets and processors don't bring in products that aren't red tractor assured, to put onto your plate from a pork chop or a chicken breast perspective. So it all links into that. So really I suppose in that Nuffield insect group perspective, once legislation's sort of done what we can do, I think the next stage is get back onto Red Tractor and other people to say, well, what are you doing? How do we then, what are the hurdles we need to overcome there? What information do they need? And just making sure that insect producers know all that. Because I think a lot of the time they're new to farming, insect producers. It's like, it's quite rare, I think, to go, unlike yourself, potentially, that has farming background. A lot of them have come from business backgrounds,
They see the bright lights of this industry that's, got a 30+% combined annual growth rate and think,
Yeah,
right, this is a get rich quick scheme. I'm going to get in and go and do it. And, it'll be easy. And
yeah,
then
yeah.
they suddenly realize that there's quite a lot of complexity in the food system.
There is. I mean, there is. I mean, you can argue that it's easier to feed humans than it is pigs and chickens, but the Novel Food Act was also a hurdle for
Yeah.
insects, and they sort of like shut down a couple of conventions, didn't they? But everyone fears the unknown and the new, and this is just another one of those areas where we need to put that out there. I think the only other benefit that doing quite a few different projects gave me is every time we did a consumer perception, it was always never as bad as you'd assume. People think people won't want animals to be fed insects, or people will want to eat insects themselves. If you've got a good enough marketing or reason behind it, there is no problem with it. I think if you package it badly, or you try and push it down people's throats, then there can be an immediate scare response. But there isn't, when it's been put to them in the right manner. I've never seen it be bad news.
Well, that's it. A lot of it is about the story you tell prior to asking them the question, right? If you say,
Yeah.
like you said at the start, why have we got these bloody legislation when chickens is part of their natural diet? You give them a little wriggly worm, they love it. The broiler chickens that I've been feeding live larvae to over the past year or two, they go mad for it. They love it. I mean, they don't really fight each other for it, but they get up off
Oh,
their feet, which is quite a rarity in broiler production because they
depends
get
how
so
big they are. But yeah.
big and
Yeah.
fat. No, even when they're big, they love it. They get up off their feet.
No, I mean that. Obviously, the bigger they get, the more weeks of their. I mean, depending on your farm, you're only there for
Yeah.
35 to 42
Or
days. But I think if you look at aqua, what is it? Juvenile fish is 70% of their diet is insects. It's the majority of what they would eat. And pigs, pigs are foragers, and they would forage all day for nuts and things, but the majority of what they would eat would be insects.
Yeah, so why are we not doing it? And that's probably quite a good one to end the podcast on, Heidi. Thank you so much for your time coming on the Black Soldier Fly Leaders podcast. It's been brilliant having your expertise here and telling us all about how to get insects into agriculture in the UK. It sounds like quite a hard, tricky path ahead, but we'll keep trying, won't we?
We've got to. Thank you for your time, David. Thank you for inviting me again.
Cheers.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Oh, what a brilliant episode that was with Heidi, someone who I know very well, but it seemed to me that regulations haven't really changed, which is a problem, and it's always a sticking point here in the UK and Europe and many places in the world, and that's what I'm sort of finding out with these different podcast episodes that I'm doing with different guests from around the world. It was really interesting to hear her views on nutrition, having working in the animal feed industry. From what I got, I thought that there was probably more of an interest from Heidi on the fat. Maybe that's because she is working now in the animal feed additive market. But, the lauric acid content from the fat and perhaps the lesser regulatory burden versus the protein, selling that product, the fat, into piglet diets for potentially £1,500 a tonne if we're comparing with coconut oil, then that is a quite a big revenue stream for insect producers and something that we should be looking at more to complement all of the other revenue streams, whether it's gate fees, protein, frass, whatever it might be. The problem that Heidi was talking about is the lack of standards, and this is all over the world, I think, because it's a new industry. And how can we get Red Tractor, which here in the UK is essentially the food production assurance scheme, to say that the livestock has been produced in the right way, using the right inputs and using the correct welfare standards and so on and so forth. So how can we get insects incorporated into this? And so if you are working for Red Tractor out there or any of these assurance schemes out in the world, then would you consider black soldier fly production in your assurance scheme? Why would you? Why wouldn't you? And I'd be keen to hear from you. But anyway, that is all for now from this episode of the Black Soldier Fly Leaders podcast. As I've said before, that gets released every 2 weeks on a Tuesday. So you'll have to wait 2 weeks more for the next one, which is with Morgan Brill. And I've no idea if I've pronounced that correctly, but she is from Living Soils in Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. So stay tuned for more. Please like, share, comment, and tell all your mates about this podcast because it is fantastic. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.